Freydis Eiriksdottir, the Viking woman who sailed to America 500 years before Columbus. The warrior who fought while pregnant. The shield maiden who terrorized enemies in the most shocking way imaginable. Daughter of Eric the Red. Sister of Leif Erikson. The woman who proved that female Vikings were just as brave and just as brutal as any man. This is not mythology. This is archaeological fact. The Norse reached North America in the year 1010. They built settlements. They fought the native peoples. And leading one of these expeditions was a pregnant woman with red hair and an iron will. This is the story the history books don't tell you. This is the saga of conquest, courage, and controversy. This is the true story of Freydis Eiriksdottir, the Viking woman who conquered the New World. Sweyn Forkbeard, the Viking king who conquered England on Christmas Day. The warrior who built an empire spanning 3 kingdoms. The father who founded a dynasty that would rule England for decades. The man whose forked beard became a symbol of power and intimidation. This is the story of the Viking conquest that succeeded, the king that history forgot, the warrior who proved that the age of Viking dominance was not yet over. This is the legend of Sweyn Forkbeard, the king of Denmark, Norway, and England, the man who changed history with a sword and an iron will. The year was approximately 960 AD when Sweyn Haraldsson was born in Denmark, son of King Harald Bluetooth, the monarch who had unified Denmark and forced Christianity on his people. Sweyn grew up in a Denmark that was transitioning from pagan traditions to Christian rule, from independent chieftains to centralized royal authority, from the old Viking ways to a more European-style kingdom. This transition created tensions and opportunities that would shape Sweyn's entire life and career. His father, Harald Bluetooth, was one of the most significant Danish kings in history, a transformative figure whose reign fundamentally changed Danish society and whose legacy extends even to modern technology through the Bluetooth wireless standard named after him. Harald had converted to Christianity around 965 AD. Whether from genuine religious conviction or shrewd political calculation, to align Denmark with Christian Europe remains debated by historians. His conversion was not a private spiritual matter, but a public political act with enormous consequences. Harald used Christianity as a tool of centralization and royal power. By establishing churches and monasteries throughout Denmark, he created institutions loyal to the crown rather than to local chieftains. By claiming divine sanction for his rule as a Christian monarch, he elevated royal authority above traditional Norse customs that had limited kingly power. By aligning with the Church and Christian kingdoms of Europe, he gained access to continental political networks, trade relationships, and diplomatic support. But these changes came at enormous cost to traditional Danish society and culture. The old Norse gods, Odin and Thor and Freyr, were declared false and their worship forbidden. Pagan temples were destroyed or converted to Christian churches. Traditional rituals and festivals were banned or adapted to Christian purposes. The skalds and völvas, the poets and seers who had preserved Norse culture and wisdom, lost their central social role as Christian priests, took over religious and educational functions. Harald's centralization efforts were equally disruptive. He built a series of massive circular fortresses, the Trelleborg fortifications, at strategic locations throughout Denmark. These fortresses, engineering marvels for their time with precise geometric layouts and sophisticated construction, served as bases for royal military power, symbols of centralized authority, reminders that the king's reach extended throughout the kingdom. But building and garrisoning these fortresses required heavy taxation, forced labor, and the subordination of local authority to royal will. Young Sweyn grew up watching these transformations and the resentments they created. He was raised nominally as a Christian, baptized and educated in the new faith. But he was also a product of Danish warrior culture that had only superficially adopted Christianity. He saw his father struggling to maintain control against nobles who resented centralization, pagans who mourned the old gods, common people ground down by taxation and forced labor, external enemies who saw Denmark's internal conflicts as opportunities. The relationship between Sweyn and Harald was complex and ultimately tragic. Father and son should have been natural allies, with Harald grooming Sweyn to inherit and continue his work. But generational conflicts, policy disputes, personality clashes, and probably the ambitions of rival advisors created a gulf between them that would end in violence. The relationship between Sweyn and his father Harald deteriorated as Sweyn reached adulthood. The sources are unclear about exactly why, but several factors seem to have contributed. Sweyn apparently sympathized with the pagan faction that resented Harald's Christian policies, though whether from genuine religious conviction or political opportunism is impossible to determine. He may have been impatient for power, unwilling to wait for his father to die before claiming the throne. Personal conflicts between father and son, the eternal struggle between generations, probably played a role. Around 986 or 987 AD, the conflict came to a head. Sweyn led a rebellion against his own father, gathering support from nobles who opposed Harald's policies, promising a return to traditional ways or at least an easing of Harald's heavy-handed rule. This was patricide in political form, a son rising against his father, one of the most serious violations of both pagan and Christian morality. But Sweyn was willing to cross that line for power. The rebellion succeeded. Harald Bluetooth was driven from Denmark, fleeing to territories still loyal to him, dying shortly thereafter around 987 AD, possibly from wounds received in battle against his own son's forces. Sweyn became King of Denmark, having seized power through violence and betrayal, establishing a pattern that would characterize his entire reign. He was approximately 27 years old, in the prime of life, ambitious and ruthless, ready to build an empire. As King of Denmark, Sweyn faced immediate challenges. His seizure of power through rebellion against his father had created legitimacy problems. Some nobles questioned his right to rule. Some Christians were horrified by his patricide. Some pagan elements expected him to reverse his father's Christian policies entirely. Sweyn had to navigate these competing demands while consolidating his authority and dealing with external threats. He chose a middle path on religion that showed his political cunning. He did not attempt to reverse Christianity entirely, which would have alienated powerful Christian factions and brought conflict with the Church and other Christian kingdoms. But he also did not enforce Christianity as strictly as his father had, allowing more tolerance for traditional practices, winning support from pagan elements without completely breaking with Christian Europe. This pragmatic approach to religion would characterize his rule. Sweyn's ambitions extended far beyond Denmark. He looked north to Norway, south to England, seeing opportunities for conquest and expansion. Norway at this time was ruled by Olaf Tryggvason, a king who was enforcing Christian conversion with methods even more brutal than Harald Bluetooth had used. This created resentment among Norwegian nobles and opportunities for Sweyn to intervene. In the year 1000, Sweyn allied with the Swedish king Olaf Skotkonung and Eric of Lade, a Norwegian earl who opposed Olaf Tryggvason. Together they confronted Olaf's fleet at the Battle of Svolder, one of the most famous naval battles in Scandinavian history. The battle was fierce and bloody, fought between hundreds of ships in the Baltic Sea, with thousands of warriors clashing in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Olaf Tryggvason, seeing the battle lost and refusing to be captured, allegedly leaped into the sea in full armor and drowned, choosing death over surrender. His kingdom of Norway was divided between the victorious allies, with Sweyn gaining control over significant Norwegian territories. Sweyn now ruled much of both Denmark and Norway, making him one of the most powerful rulers in Scandinavia. But Sweyn's greatest ambitions focused on England, the wealthy kingdom across the North Sea that had been raided by Vikings for 2 centuries but never fully conquered. England under King Aethelred II, known to history as Aethelred the Unready, was weak and divided, plagued by incompetent leadership and internal conflicts. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a litany of Danish raids during this period, with English forces repeatedly failing to mount effective resistance. Sweyn had personal reasons to hate Aethelred beyond simple ambition for conquest. In 1002, Aethelred had ordered the St. Brice's Day Massacre, a coordinated killing of Danish settlers throughout England. This massacre, carried out on November 13, 1002, targeted Danish men, women, and children who had been living peacefully in England, some for generations. Among the victims was Sweyn's sister Gunhilde and her family, murdered in the massacre. When news of the massacre reached Sweyn, he swore vengeance. What had been opportunistic raiding would become a systematic campaign of conquest and revenge. Sweyn would not just raid England for treasure. He would conquer it, rule it, destroy Aethelred and everything he represented. The St. Brice's Day massacre transformed Sweyn from a raider into a conqueror, from a king seeking wealth into an avenger seeking blood. Sweyn's campaigns against England began in earnest around 1003 and continued intermittently for over a decade, transforming from revenge raids into a systematic conquest campaign that would culminate in the complete subjugation of England. These were not the opportunistic hit-and-run raids that had characterized earlier Viking attacks on England. These were organized military invasions with clear political objectives, supported by sophisticated logistics, employing both military force and political maneuvering to achieve their goals. Each campaign season, Sweyn would assemble a large fleet in Denmark, gathering ships and warriors from throughout his kingdom and from allied or mercenary forces. This was not military conquest, but political acclamation. English nobles and Danish settlers alike recognized Sweyn as their king, pledging loyalty, providing supplies and intelligence, opening their fortifications to his forces. In a matter of weeks, without fighting a single major battle, Sweyn controlled the entire north of England. The 5 boroughs, Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford, cities established by earlier Danish settlers in the 9th century, and still heavily Scandinavian in population and culture, welcomed Sweyn enthusiastically. These were wealthy trading centers, strategically located, politically significant. Their rapid submission gave Sweyn control of central England's commercial heart and demonstrated to wavering English nobles that resistance was futile. Sweyn then moved south with methodical inevitability, accepting submissions from region after region. Oxford opened its gates. Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, submitted peacefully. Bath, Southampton, and the entire southwest bent the knee. English nobles, seeing their king unable to mount effective resistance, calculating where their interests lay, abandoned Aethelred in droves. Some genuinely preferred Sweyn's strong rule to Aethelred's incompetence. Others simply recognized reality and chose the winning side. The result was the same, a cascade of submissions that left Aethelred increasingly isolated. London held out longer than the rest of England, protected by walls and by the presence of Aethelred himself. But London's resistance was ultimately futile. Aethelred, seeing the hopelessness of his position, fled England entirely, taking refuge with his wife's family in Normandy. The greatest city in England, abandoned by its king, opened its gates to Sweyn. On Christmas Day, 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard was proclaimed King of England. It was a moment of supreme triumph, the culmination of years of planning and fighting, revenge for the St. Brice's Day massacre, validation of Sweyn's life of conquest and ambition. He now ruled Denmark, Norway, and England, an empire spanning the North Sea, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. But Sweyn's triumph was tragically and mysteriously brief. In February 1014, just 5 weeks after his coronation as King of England on Christmas Day, Sweyn died suddenly at his headquarters in Gainsborough. The circumstances of his death remain unclear and controversial. Some sources suggest he died from illness, perhaps a sudden fever or stroke. Other accounts hint at injuries, possibly from a fall from his horse or an accident. The most dramatic version, recorded in later English chronicles possibly influenced by wishful thinking or propaganda, claims he was killed by the ghost of Saint Edmund, a martyred English king whose church Sweyn had supposedly threatened to destroy. Whatever the actual cause, the timing was catastrophic for Danish ambitions. Sweyn was approximately 54 years old, at the absolute height of his power, having achieved the culmination of his life's ambition. He had conquered England, avenged the St. Brice's Day Massacre, established Danish rule over a North Sea empire. And then, suddenly, he was gone, his conquest incomplete, his settlement of England barely begun, his son unprepared to hold what his father had won. His death threw England and Scandinavia into immediate political chaos. Sweyn's son Canute was with the Danish army in England, but he was young, probably only about 18 years old, untested as a military leader, lacking his father's authority and reputation. The Danish fleet and army in England acclaimed him as king, but this acclamation was not enough to secure the conquest against a determined English counterattack. Aethelred, hearing news of Sweyn's death from his exile in Normandy, saw his opportunity for restoration. He sent messengers to English nobles, promising reforms and better government if they would support his return, playing on English nationalism and resentment of Danish rule, offering amnesty to those who had submitted to Sweyn. Many English nobles, who had submitted to Sweyn from calculation rather than enthusiasm, now calculated that Aethelred's return might be in their interests. The English political elite, led by the Witan, the Council of Nobles and Bishops, sent terms to Aethelred. They would accept his return as king if he would govern better than before, if he would consult with them on major decisions, if he would rule according to law rather than arbitrary will. Aethelred agreed to these terms, probably with no intention of keeping them, but the agreement allowed the Witan to bring him back as legitimate king with formal conditions attached. Aethelred returned to England in spring 1014, quickly rallying English forces and moving against the Danish army. Canute, recognizing that he lacked the strength to hold England against a restored Aethelred backed by English nationalism, made the difficult decision to withdraw. These weren't just Danish Vikings, but warriors from throughout Scandinavia and even beyond, attracted by the wealth of England and the reputation of Sweyn as a successful war leader who rewarded his followers generously. The fleets that descended on England numbered in the hundreds of ships, carrying thousands of warriors, representing massive investments of resources and organization. The invasions followed a pattern that showed Sweyn's strategic sophistication. He would typically land on the English coast during the summer campaigning season, choosing locations that offered strategic advantages. Sometimes he struck at the wealthy monasteries and towns of southern England. Other times he landed in the north where Danish settlement was heaviest and where he could expect some local support. He established fortified bases from which his forces could raid the surrounding countryside while remaining protected from English counterattacks. These bases served multiple purposes beyond just military security. They were markets where his warriors could sell plunder and buy supplies. They were intimidation tools, visible reminders of Danish power planted on English soil. They were negotiating platforms from which Sweyn could communicate with English authorities, demand tribute, make threats, offer terms. The psychological impact of these permanent Danish military positions on English morale was enormous. Sweyn's forces would fan out from these bases, raiding systematically through the surrounding regions. But these raids were not random pillaging. They were calculated to apply maximum pressure on English authorities and populations. Monasteries and churches were particular targets, both because they contained wealth and because attacking them demonstrated the powerlessness of English religious and secular authorities to protect even their holiest sites. Towns that resisted were burned and their populations killed or enslaved, creating object lessons that encouraged other communities to submit peacefully. The English response under Aethelred was consistently incompetent and counterproductive. Aethelred's primary strategy was paying Danegeld, massive tribute payments that were supposed to buy peace, but actually encouraged further Danish aggression. The first major Danegeld payment in 991, before Sweyn's campaigns began, had been 10,000 pounds of silver, an enormous sum. By 1012, with Sweyn's pressure mounting, England paid 48,000 pounds of silver, an almost incomprehensible fortune extracted from English taxpayers through brutal taxation. These payments demonstrated several things to contemporaries. They showed that England was wealthy, encouraging further attacks. They proved that Aethelred preferred paying tribute to fighting effectively, marking him as weak. They impoverished the English treasury and common people through taxation while enriching Danish warriors. They created resentment among English nobles and commoners who saw their wealth flowing to Danish invaders while receiving no protection in return. The Danegeld payments, intended to buy peace, actually weakened England and encouraged conquest. Aethelred's military responses were equally futile. English forces, when they could be assembled, were poorly led and easily defeated. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by English monks and therefore hardly sympathetic to the Danes, records battle after battle, year after year, where English armies were routed by numerically inferior Danish forces. English naval forces failed to prevent Danish fleets from raiding at will. English fortifications proved unable to resist Danish siege tactics. English morale crumbled under the relentless pressure of repeated defeat. In 1013, Sweyn launched his final and most ambitious invasion of England, the campaign that would achieve what a decade of raiding had prepared. This was not another raid for treasure or another attempt to extract Danegeld. This was a conquest campaign, carefully planned and brilliantly executed, designed to end Aethelred's reign and make Sweyn king of England. He brought the largest fleet and army he had ever assembled for an English campaign, representing the military might of his entire North Sea empire. His strategy was masterful in its combination of military power and political sophistication. He landed not in the south near London where Aethelred's strength was concentrated, but in the north at Gainsborough in Lincolnshire, in the heart of the Danelaw where Danish settlement was densest and where the population shared cultural and linguistic connections with Sweyn's forces. This was not just militarily smart, it was politically brilliant, landing among people who might view him as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The response exceeded even Sweyn's expectations. The entire region of Northumbria, stretching from the Scottish border south through Yorkshire and into the northern Midlands, submitted to Sweyn almost immediately. He could not even take his father's body with him for proper burial in Denmark. Sweyn was buried at Gainsborough, in the land he had conquered but could not hold, his grave becoming a temporary marker of a conquest that seemed to have failed. But the story did not end with Sweyn's death and Canute's withdrawal. Sweyn had planted seeds that would bear fruit in the next generation. His son Canute had learned from his father's example and would not give up on England. Canute spent 1014 and 1015 preparing for a return, gathering resources in Denmark, recruiting warriors, building an even larger fleet than his father had commanded, planning a campaign that would succeed where his father's had been interrupted. In 1015, Canute returned to England with this massive invasion force, initiating a brutal 2-year war of conquest. This time, he was not the untested boy who had fled in 1014, but a hardened warrior king in his own right, employing both his father's military tactics and political sophistication. English resistance, already demoralized by years of Danish pressure, collapsed region by region. Aethelred died in April 1016, possibly from illness, possibly from the stress of seeing his kingdom conquered yet again. After Aethelred's death, his son Edmund Ironside, a much more capable military leader than his father, led English resistance and fought several bloody battles against Canute. But even Edmund's courage and skill could not overcome the fundamental weaknesses of English military and political organization, or the strength of Danish forces. In October 1016, after the Battle of Ascendun, where Danish forces won a decisive victory, Edmund and Canute agreed to partition England between them. When Edmund died mysteriously just weeks later in November 1016, Canute became sole king of all England. Canute would rule England for 19 years, from 1016 until his death in 1035, proving to be one of medieval England's most capable and successful kings. He would eventually add Denmark and Norway to his English kingdom, creating the North Sea Empire that his father Sweyn had envisioned. He would be remembered not as a brutal conqueror, but as a wise and just king, patron of the church, protector of English laws and customs, a ruler who successfully integrated Danish and English elements into a stable government. This was Sweyn's true legacy, realized through his son. The conquest of 1013, seemingly undone by Sweyn's unexpected death, proved to be merely the first act of a longer drama. Sweyn had demonstrated that England could be conquered, had shown the weakness of English resistance, had established Danish claims and Danish bases. Canute would complete what his father started, building on Sweyn's foundation to create an empire that would last for a generation and fundamentally alter English history. Sweyn Forkbeard represents a fascinating and often overlooked figure in the transition from Viking age to medieval European kingdoms. He was both a Viking warrior in the old tradition, raiding and conquering through military force, and a sophisticated medieval king who understood that lasting power required political skill, diplomatic maneuvering, and administrative competence alongside military might. He raided like Ragnar, but he also built institutions, made alliances, and governed like a medieval monarch. His nickname, Forkbeard, or Tviskag in Old Norse, referring to his distinctively forked beard where the facial hair split into 2 points, became a symbol recognized and feared throughout Northern Europe. Whether Sweyn cultivated this distinctive appearance deliberately as a personal brand, a way of making himself instantly recognizable and memorable, or whether it was simply his natural beard style, the forked beard became his trademark. In an age before mass media or photography, distinctive physical appearance was crucial for leaders who needed to be recognized by followers and feared by enemies. Sweyn's forked beard served that purpose perfectly, making him a figure who could not be mistaken for anyone else. The conquest of England that Sweyn achieved, even if only briefly, proved that Viking military power was not yet exhausted in the early 11th century. Harald Hardrada's invasion in 1066 is often called the last great Viking invasion. But Sweyn's conquest of England in 1013 was arguably more successful, actually achieving complete conquest rather than dying in defeat. The Viking Age did not end with a whimper, but with Sweyn's conquest, a final demonstration of Viking capability. From rebel son who overthrew his own father to king of 3 kingdoms, from Danish warrior to conqueror of England, from avenger of the St. Brice's Day massacre to founder of a dynasty that would rule England for decades, Sweyn Forkbeard carved his name into history with a sword and cunning. He was ruthless and brilliant, patient and aggressive, traditional Viking and medieval king. His legacy lived on through his son Canute and changed England forever. If you enjoyed this epic saga of the Viking king who conquered England, make sure to subscribe to Viking Valhalla for more untold stories of the greatest warriors history has ever known. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another legendary tale. Which Viking legend should we explore next? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, may your courage be legendary and your conquests complete. Skål.